good morning, everyone. My name is Zachary Rainey. I'm the Partnerships and Events Manager here at One Valley. Very excited to have you guys join us today. This is kind of our first flagship kind of at doing an AMA, which we're really excited about hosting together today with one of our mentors here, Otto Pohl. Just couldn't be more happy to have just a high caliber speaker with us, and we're really excited to kind of be joined by him and to get everything ready in that regard. For kind of the day itself, we're planning on just facilitating a few questions. If anybody in the chat or anybody that's here, any of the participants want to ask any questions of Otto, feel free to go ahead and do that in our chat, or we can facilitate it through our Q&A. Yeah, let's just kind of show you kind of what we're getting started. For the uninitiated, let's go ahead and click here, just to talk about a little bit about who we are and what we do. Passport is the world's most comprehensive digital platform. We're connecting entrepreneurs, emerging startups with access to vital resources, networks, significant savings on essential business tools. We have yes, it is. Sorry, I'm also facilitating some questions via my Slack, so I'm getting some pings here. Yeah, and just want to let everybody know kind of who our mentor is that we're going to be joined today. We're joined by Otto Pohl. He's a communications consultant. He's a mentor, an angel investor who helps startups to kind of tell their story better. With his background in entrepreneurship and communications, he creates a foundational communication and PR strategy, beginning with messaging across the company website, across pitch decks, white papers, and through thought leadership articles. He works with a wide range of startups, and his specialty is kind of B2B companies in the tech and science and medical industries. Yeah, I'm happy to kind of welcome Otto to the stage. Otto, thank you so much for joining us.
I love it. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, and so we have a couple of attendees here. This is going to be kind of a rolling basis of people probably coming, joining, and leaving, wanting to ask any questions and things like that. To our audience that have just joined us recently, feel free to ask any questions you have about PR and communications. Please leverage this time to benefit yourself as much as possible. This is really for you, the community. And so we would love to kind of have those questions either pop up in our chat here or through the Q&A box that we have at the bottom of this webinar. I'd love to give Otto a little bit of time to kind of speak to kind of PR communications, maybe introduce yourself as well, kind of talk a little bit more about your experience. That might trigger a couple of questions in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much, Zachary. Appreciate it. And it's a delight to be here. Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I'll give you a few quick sort of background on me and what I do, and then sort of why I approach the challenge the way I do. So I started out as a journalist, which I love. It's awesome career, pays terribly, even worse now maybe than it did back then, but it's sort of organized curiosity, and it was a fabulous opportunity for me to learn how the sort of media landscape sees sort of potential news, and so that helped me really sort of tell those stories. But I started from that. I was also always entrepreneurial in nature. I've co-founded 4 different companies over the years, and then I sort of combined that and was communications director for a couple of startups, and now I do this as sort of on a consultant basis. And probably the way that most people sort of realize, oh, they need someone like me to help them, is that they're like, oh, we need to get the word out. Like, oh, we need more PR. We need to get, they don't want to be the tree in the forest that falls and nobody hears, right? But what I always do is say, let's take a step back and let's think about why we want to do this, right? Like PR, actually, aside from the fact that it makes us feel good and it's something that mom will read and realize what it is we do, it's just a means to an end, right? Like the actual end is not like getting PR. The actual end is like getting more customers, selling more product, whatever, increasing your reach, getting more investors, whatever this near-term business goals are, regulatory approval. Those are what you're actually trying to do. And PR is, quote unquote, just a way to get there. And sometimes you honestly don't need it at all. Like there are certain companies that fly under the radar screen perfectly happily, make lots of money or have whatever success it is that they're looking for, and don't actually have PR. So I want everyone to understand that it's just a tool, and that step one is to make sure that you really know what it is that you're trying to do, and then work from there and say, okay, now let's talk about what it is that how PR can actually help us get there. And when you approach it from that way, and I think over the course of this hour we'll start to see, is when you approach it from that perspective, it answers kind of a lot of questions that otherwise would have seemed amorphous and non-understandable and complicated to get and sort of frustrating. And suddenly it will start to clarify things.
Excellent. And I think that kind of leads into a question that I have from the get-go. Where I'm situated in my company, technically speaking, One Valley, we're a startup for startups, right? So we definitely help out. I'm definitely in the marketing department, but I kind of want to, for the budding entrepreneurs in the audience, I kind of want to, what's the difference between your communication strategy and your marketing strategy? Do they overlap at all, or are they two separate beasts? Should you treat them differently? And kind of how would you position for your son?
Yeah, that's a great question. The goal of them ultimately is the same, right? Like the goal of marketing, of any kind of marketing, and the goal of any kind of PR is to, again, sort of get the word out to the right people in order to achieve those business goals that you're looking for. So that's the most important. That's the most important thing. The approach that you take, and that each of those fields tend to take, are related but different, and there's a good reason why often you'll have like the chief marketing officer and the director of communications works for the CMO, right? So I mean, there's a good reason why they sort of sit in the same area of the room. Generally speaking, the sort of marketing is more towards the advertising field, so that's more towards the paid sort of acquisition of customers, whereas sort of PR is more sort of burnishing the broader image. Obviously, customer acquisition is one of those, but it's it's more broad, and B, it tends to be also unpaid, and by unpaid I mean it costs resources obviously to do that, and often maybe substantial. So, but it's less of a sort of placing ads, in places. It's less where you're sort of sending checks to Google, and more where you're spending resources trying to convince journalists of what you're trying to do. But at the end of the day, they're really just two different ways of largely trying to reach the same goal.
Okay. And I guess if that's the case, then what are maybe some low-hanging fruit in terms of your PR or your communication strategy for those entrepreneurs that haven't even considered that portion of their journey yet? Like most entrepreneurs, when they first get started, they're very heavily concentrated on the product first, making sure that that's something that's competitive. And then from there, they can start looking at around, as you said, around to the trees that are in the forest and be like, oh, okay, how do we differentiate ourselves in kind of the branding and the voice of it? So what are some quick wins that are easy to kind of implement that, like if you set out early in your kind of PR career, that kind of PR communication strategy, then you're setting yourself up for success in that regard.
Yep. Well, so the very first thing that I always do, and the very first thing that I recommend everybody does, when they sort of have that hair on fire moment of like, I need to get the word out, is to say, well, hold on, like, what is the message that I'm actually going to send? The very first thing it's foundational. I don't know if it's an easy win. It might be an easy win, but it's to make sure that the message that you're trying to send about the company is actually the one that you want sent. And the reason that I emphasize this is that so often someone comes to me and says, like, I need PR, and then I go to their website and it's it's a mess. It's something. And then I ask them like, hey, what about this website? And they're like, oh yeah, that's something we put up 9 months ago. We've been meaning to change it, right? And everybody's always in the process of upgrading their website. And the fact of the matter is that if you go out and you get that PR, right, or you make, you convince TechCrunch to write the article about you, all those people that you're going to excite, right? Very first thing that they're going to do is they're going to come to your website. And so the easy win, first of all, is to make sure that your funnel is actually sort of tight. If you are going to get those people out there interested in knowledgeable about your company, and they're going to be excited about the story that you're telling, you want to make sure that you have a consistent message. And it's it's not hard. Again, it's a process, and you need to make sure you do it right. But it doesn't necessarily need to be hard in order to make sure to focus on making sure that you have your message sort of straight, and that everyone that you are getting interested learns about it. So that the first thing I would say is getting that the messaging straight. The second, and I'll get into this later, but I just might as well sort of tease it now. But like nobody cares about your company per se, right? Like generally about your startup, you're just starting up. The world is moving along perfectly, happily or messily, as the case may be, without your company. Nobody sort of, wakes. No one's like, the sun's not going to come up because your company doesn't exist. So you need to find out, your goal as an entrepreneur is always to make sure that you look bigger than your company actually is, right? Like you always want to make your company look bigger and more important. The easiest way to do that is sort of what I think of as jujitsu, right? It's like using the power of the enemy against them, using the power of existing storylines that are out there to make your company more relevant in the world as it exists today. So always think about why, what's the larger story that's already being told, into which I can sort of get my my story told. It's a little bit easier, said than done. But so often people are like, I raised $3 million, and like, that doesn't matter really, like on its own. But if you're like, I did it because there's this big thing that's going on, everybody's worried about whatever the subject is that you're trying to solve, cancer or whatever, then you have an opportunity for people who already care about that subject to suddenly say like, oh, this is part of a trend that's helping to address this issue that I already care about. So always tie it to something that already exists.
Okay. Kind of plugging into the greater narrative, I think or leveraging the greater narrative for like your own devices, I think is a good bit of strategy to kind of let people know kind of out of the gate, just to recognize where they are in the market, like own the fact, like for instance, if you're a small dog in a big ocean, or like a small fish in a big ocean, like don't pretend like you're a big fish sometimes.
Right. Talk about the ocean, right?
Yeah, talk about the ocean and its size and how it's like incompassionate, but you're kind of with the little guy. So yeah, that kind of positioning I think is very important. Just to remind people that are watching us live now, if you have any questions for Otto, feel free to mention them in the chat. If you'd like your website to if you'd love Otto to like look at your website just to give you some pointers and some tips, and you don't mind sharing with the audience, we're happy to facilitate that as well. We can do a little bit of a review. It's really kind of up to the audience members what we'd like to accomplish today. But I think Otto, you might have had something prepared for just a brief something prepared for a second. If you wanted to go over that, or I'm happy to ask you some more questions. I do have a couple more, but.
Sure. Why don't you hit me? And then I'm looking here over at my slides, and I have definitely a few that I can go through that'll hopefully be helpful.
Excellent. I mean, I guess my next question kind of relates back to your targeting, right? I mean, yes, your communication strategy is very much whoever consumes that communication is part of that strategy, but like persona mapping. A very big thing in this, in at least marketing as well. It's a huge buzzword, and so that's basically like finding the right target, finding the right audience, making sure that you understand them well, or at least you have like an individual mapped out that's your target, and if you can ever convert that person to a paying customer or something like that, then that is the ideal, right? Is there any overlap with PR communications and persona mapping? Or or is there like a difference in terms of how you're going to go about your broader communication?
Yep. So there's overlapping, and I'd say it's even so in a way PR is even more broad. Marketing generally, right, is targeted at customer acquisition, right? And so those personas that you talk about are like, okay, this is this type of customer, this is this type of customer, this is this type of customer, and often they are there's sort of different segments that might sort of have emotionally different reasons for buying the product, but maybe broadly fit into the same category. So in PR, I also, one of the very first things when I talked about that earlier, I said like, okay, well, first let's talk about the business goals and that you're trying to reach, and then let's work backwards. The first step in that working backwards is, okay, who are the audiences that we need to speak to and address and convince of something in order to achieve those business goals? And they are broader than customers. Like, so customers obviously is critical. And within customers, you might get into those marketing personas. And in fact, you might even get a little broader than that. But those are, I'd say those marketing personas are inside the customer thing. But there's obviously investors. There might be the peer group of the industry. So that's sort of thought leadership type stuff that impresses all the people when you're speaking at the conferences. You might have the employees of the company, right? That's an important group. As the company grows, you need to make sure that everybody's on the same page and is still motivated and excited to work hard for you. You might have the people that you're trying to hire. When you're a younger company, maybe there's more people that you're still about to hire than that have already been hired. And really, you need to send a strong message out to the people to the looking for a new job, and you want to get the best ones. And you need to make sure that you're sending out a message that makes it seem like, wow, that's the company I want to work for. So you sort of have those same personas, except they're broader than typically what marketing looks at, which is that just within the customer groups.
There we go. All right, I think we got you back now.
Oh, did I vanish?
Yeah, you vanished there for just a brief second, or maybe it was my internet connection. So
okay, so yeah, I don't know if I was saying anything more.
Oh no.
Anybody missed anything?
You're basically, and I understand what you're saying there. Like there are different branches of your types of communication. So you are like, for instance, your HR, and they're marketing towards the well, it's not really marketing, but it is your communication strategy with those like people that are that funnel of bringing new employees into your company. And there is the marketing funnel as well.
Yeah, and it's like investors, right? Like early on, investors is a persona, if you will. Typically, that's not one that the marketing side would look at, right? They don't think of investors as a marketing persona, but it's totally a company persona. They, for most companies, right, like hold a very important part of your long-term success, and you better convince them that you're awesome.
Yeah, I guess my next question too, like maybe this is me selfish and kind of like taking over all of this time, but in terms of like celebrating your wins and communicating your wins and celebrating them publicly, and also apologizing or owning up to bad news or bad press. That's something that I feel are kind of both touchy subjects, because you don't want to be braggadocious going into some of your communication strategies, but you also kind of want to you might also want to kind of celebrate like small wins, small victories. So as an example, with our entrepreneurs in the audience, maybe they got a POC, a proof of concept with a company that was successful, and they kind of want to make an announcement on that. Or maybe it's the double side of that. They might have had a callback where they had to call back their prototype, or they had to, and that leaked out, and so somebody published an article on TechCrunch or something like that. And so, what's kind of the strategy on celebrating your wins and mitigating your damaging press for those kind of budding
Yeah. Perfect. So yeah, two completely different things and sort of require two different approaches. I mean, first of all, on the wins thing, like no modesty here, right? Like if you have something that worked out great, like work it, baby, right? Like if you got the award, or you got you got a big name to join your advisory board, or the fundraising round went well, or whatever, that's all a great opportunity to spread the word and to sort of, humble brag about how about that, whether that's on a post on LinkedIn, or whether you actually get some press coverage on it, or whatever it might be. It's like it's that's the sort of the key toolbox that you have, and the key, sort of key tools in that box. And so you should absolutely use that, and don't worry about oh well, you know, I want to be modest about that. So the only thing I would say there is that, you know, very often people think that, oh, just because something happened, like just because I raised that, you know, $3 million Series A, which is awesome, by the way, like it's an incredible amount of money. It's wonderful, and you know, we're all very proud, right? But the fact of the matter is in today's market, shockingly, right, like a $3 million seed round is hardly news in its own right. So you always have to make sure that when you do have something that you think is truly great, that, you know, don't be surprised or depressed when, you know, the rest of the world yawns a bit, but you should absolutely push it and present it the right way and do what you can to get that out there, because hey, that's sort of what you have to work with until you sign the big deal with Apple or whatever. Those are the things you have to work with. On the negative side, you know, if you do have, so the standard crisis communications playbook is pretty straightforward, right? It's you want to own up to it quickly, you want to reverse it, you want to sort of have the sort of mea culpa and correct what you want to do. So you want to get out ahead of it. What you also don't want to do is you don't want to make it a bigger problem than it is already. Like, let's say, you know, you did the Kickstarter and you launched a product and it turned out that the first version was delayed, or that you know, delivered it later, or that it didn't really work as well. You know, chances are those, like, you know, those 500 people flooding your inbox are like really angry, and it feels like the whole world, and oh my gosh, the inbox is blown up. But also don't forget that, like, the rest of the world doesn't even know that you exist, and so don't make it bigger than it needs to be. Like, deal with those people, deal with the group that was addressed in a forthright, upcoming manner, and then move on. And don't think just because you are lying awake at night, you know, sort of stressed out about this, don't think that everybody else is as well. So you know, don't make it bigger than it needs to be.
I love that advice. I think that's good, is just kind of owning up to it, to the audience, but making sure that you're not communicating that failure to it, like, and making that your defining.
Right, exactly. Don't, yeah. Move on.
Yeah, just keep moving. I would love to kind of pick your brain about your experience as well. Like, I understand that you're communications consultant, specifically working with startups for a number of years. So I'm sure you've helped with hundreds of startups kind of cultivate their PR and communication strategy. I would love to kind of ask you, like, what's a win or a turnaround through your consulting career that you've kind of like put on the books, that either surprised you, that it was or you helped their branding, something that sticks out in your brain, like in like an example of a strategy where they were struggling, and it wasn't so much a rehaul of their entire communication strategy, but it was more of just a small tweak to how they're positioning themselves, and that paid off big dividends. If you have a memory or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, so one example of a time when I was working, I was at Figure Technologies, which is a large blockchain fintech company.
Went public recently. I think they're like a couple $1 billion valuations. We're actually working with Figure now as well. So
yeah, it's an amazing company, and really just getting started. And I was their first head of communications a couple years ago. And what I did there is, so their sort of first product was what's called a HELOC. So that's a home equity line of credit. And they were, so Mike Cagney, the founder, realized that he couldn't just sort of build a blockchain for the fintech world and then expect the world to rush to his doors. He realized he essentially needed to be his first customer. So he had to build two products in parallel. He had to build the blockchain that sort of does all these transactions and closes them more efficiently and yields all kinds of benefits. And then simultaneously build up a big home equity, or just some kind of a lending company, some kind of a company that was producing all this these financial product that could be put onto the blockchain, so that he could show that that it was all more efficient, and then sort of get the flywheel spinning by himself. And so that was where he started, and now it's really starting to pick up, and all these other companies are realizing, wait a minute, I can save all this money, like, let's talk. But at the time, they were producing these home equity lines of credit I think they were doing something like $50 million, $70 million a month of production. And the goal was obviously to sort of raise that, because that was the, they wanted to hit like $1 billion. I think at that point was the goal, $1 billion of cumulative financial products that are handled by the Provenance blockchain. And the strategy that I took was I did some data research. We had a great data team, and we looked through all of this U.S. homeowners. You can do some incredible sort of research when you go through all the sort of credit rating, those credit bureaus. They have staggering and frankly kind of shocking amounts of data on every American. And so we realized that, wow, the amount of money that is in the that those consumers have on credit card debt, if they actually, the sort of short-term expensive debt, if they roll that over into HELOC, which is essentially the second cheapest debt you can get, right? The cheapest is your primary mortgage. The second is sort of, again, the sort of asset-backed home equity lines of credit. And then it gets more expensive as you start moving towards things like credit card debt. Realize if all American homeowners simply shifted their short-term debt, that again, that expensive credit card debt, into that sort of asset-backed debt, which was growing, the availability of which was growing because home prices were rising, then America would save $100 billion in interest payments a year. And so that is the kind of thing that sort of, journalists love numbers, and that was sort of became the foundation of an entire sort of fall campaign that we did around sort of getting on television and radio and newspapers, obviously, and that really helped drive awareness, because those are the types of eye-popping numbers. Again, it's a conversation not about the product, right? Like, it's a conversation about the larger issue, like who doesn't want to save money, and ways that you can be smarter with your home. And then that obviously ties back into the product. If we just gone out and said, oh, we're this great home equity line of credit lender, you should write about us, not that interesting. But you start with the sort of the larger conversation and then lead back. And so that turned out to be very successful. And I think it also ties into some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me, whenever you bring up blockchain, it's kind of a trigger word for a lot of people in the tech community. Some people love it, some people hate it. In boardrooms, it's mostly misunderstood, right? And so I think that's something that I'd also kind of like to ask you on, is like, what is your role? So say a lot of the entrepreneurs are coming up with very innovative new products, like not on the market again. So blockchain was, I mean, it's not new anymore. It's a couple of years old, but even still, it's misunderstood or misrepresented in a lot of different ways. Most people are familiar with Bitcoin, but it's definitely not the end all be all of blockchain. So what is your role if you are bringing something new and innovative, where you're going to have to do a little bit of education? Like, you're going to have to let them know. You're going to have to or convince either your audience, your investor, the employees joining your company. It goes across all of your channels on what this innovative technology is, and then kind of like extrapolating from there. Do you is education part of the strategy, or should that be left to a different device and you kind of take
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a tough one, right? To the degree that you need to do education, suddenly you need to effectively sell something else. You need to sort of sell the knowledge before you can sell the product, and it's hard enough to sell one thing. But the fact of the matter is that yes, education can be and sometimes needs to be a large part of what you do. It depends to some degree on the size of the audience that it is that you're addressing, right? So when you're trying to sell, for example, sort of blockchain to the financial services industry, there's actually the audience is, at least the initial audience, relatively small, right? Like, you need to convince a couple of key people, and I'm not saying that that's easy, but you have to convince a couple of key people that the benefits are, the benefits are very sort of real and the like. It's a lot harder if you're introducing something, let's say, to the a mass market product that is sort of foundationally different from everything that they have today, and that can be a lot harder. Probably the first rule of thumb is to do as effectively as little education as you need, and is to always sort of focus on the benefit, right? So in a way at Figure, right, it's like, let's not talk about like the underlying technology. It's like in a way, like, let's talk about the fact that you're saving money. Like everybody gets the fact that you're saving money. Like this is a black box that saves you money. Like what else do you need to know? And that's oversimplifying it, but I think is an important thing that and it gets into a larger point when you're trying to sort of educate effectively as little as possible in order to because the point is people aren't buying the technology, they're buying the benefits. And I think that's also another really important point that's more broad than that. And that is that when we develop a product, we become in a way almost necessarily very product centric, right? Like we have this thing, it's our baby. We hire all these engineers or these other people who develop it and design it. Maybe we patented it. We have all these roadmaps. We're meeting after meeting trying to figure out like, how to make this thing better. But when you turn around to sell it, and so the instinct is when you turn around to sell it, you want to be like, and we like, look at these 8 features that we have and look how awesome it is. And let me teach you about like why it's just so awesome or how this engineering thing does da. You lose sight of the fact that actually people are not interested in the product. They're interested in what it does for them, right? Like the why, like I'm just a busy, mom who's trying to, get her kids to school on time. Like, how is this making my life better? And so you really need to focus on that why and sort of what that core benefit is. And a lot of times that means you get to like go right past all of the sort of tech gobbledygook that might sort of need education. The cliche example that's often used, and it's semi-valid, and but it's sort of overused and maybe trite, but still, like when you look at the Apple, right, the iPhone ads, right, they're never about like how many gigabytes and all the other sort of benefits of the 60 hertz refresh screen rate, etc. Right? It's like it unleashes your inner artist, right, or it makes you feel like a more artistic person, which is. In a way, it's like you can imagine all those like engineers spending millions of hours sort of perfecting the inner technology of the latest iPhone, and they all want to talk about it, but the ads don't talk about it at all. And so in a lot of ways, to the degree you need to educate, when your instinct is I need to educate, maybe your first instinct or response should be maybe I don't have to. Maybe I can just address the needs that I'm actually resolving today.
That's a fantastic point. I think there is something to be said about just taking that strategy of being like, listen, you don't have to understand all of it. You just need to kind of get the results and understand what the results are. We can prove these results, right? And then it kind of leveraging that to be to kind of facilitate the trust backwards into the product or service. Just to remind a couple of the attendees here, if you have anything that you would like to ask Otto, feel free to kind of post that question in chat. We're happy to answer it there. I'm happy to keep asking questions just because I have tons for you. I never have an opportunity to ask a professional about PR and communication. So I think I'm happy to ask another question about kind of the big dogs in the industry. You mentioned Apple kind of having like their branding has morphed into just you're bringing out your inner artist, and they're so prolific in the like just the advertising space. They own a lot of the channels, their own channels. They dominate a lot of the other channels. So whenever you're I create a phone or I create a competitive product, it doesn't have to be a direct competitor to Apple, but it could be like a smartwatch that kind of competes with the Apple Watch. How do I bring that to a market that's already dominated by massive names, and how do I kind of bring that to and position myself where I might not have the budget or it might not be the best product yet, but working with me will definitely I'll make sure that it's being like you're being serviced, and this product will be built for you.
The interesting thing about like in your scenario, right? Like in your scenario, it's kind of very obvious, right? In that sense of like, let's say I was bringing out a new phone and you're like, oh, but everyone's like, yeah, but what about Android and Apple? And you want to do that new one. So in that case, it's kind of very obvious that there's this sort of massive market leaders, and you're how are you ever going to compete? The fact of the matter is that most startups they also actually have these sort of massive, big dreams, right? Like that's why you're starting a company. You have this, you see this major disease that you're trying to cure, or you have this this sort of new video platform that you're trying to launch, or you have this new way that you want to sell insurance, and right, and these plans they're always $billion, right? They're always these massive sort of dreams. And in general, I would say status quo is the apple in the room, right? Like for most of these things, like for you to actually overcome the status quo, people just doing business as usual is almost in most cases as big as trying to fight Apple or Amazon. In cases where there isn't the obvious sort of a literal competitor, and so the way to get going is to be very clear on the roadmap that you're going to take. So let's say you were launching this new phone, right? Sure, your goal is to be as big as Apple. That's fine. But what you need to really think about is where are your first 100 or 1,000 customers going to come from? Why are you launching this phone? And you might, well, it's better for gaming. So you're like, okay, so like who is your actual audience? And like gamers, oh, but maybe it's not just the people playing some kind of a sort of pick 5 game mechanic, but they're actually like, I don't know, hardcore first person shooters. And you're like, okay, so you really start to narrow this down into something that's very specific. And in this hypothetical example I'm making up on the spot, like let's say you had that sort of that very narrow sort of first person shooter, and it's it's massively multi game, so it's like the latency is is important, or what. You really narrow it down to something that's really tight, and then you make sure that you get those people to fall in absolute love with the product. The emotional challenge that a lot of entrepreneurs have when they sort of approach that is you come in thinking like, I want to sell a phone to like everybody, right? Like I want to solve all these diseases. And then like when you end up is that your actual messaging on day one is like targeted at like the 1,000 people who are whatever, million people that play first person shooter games on 5G, whatever, like it's this really narrow thing. And they're like, but wait a minute, like what happened to my big phone vision? And the point is like that'll come, but it's not going to come if you don't get this first step right. And the example I always use, maybe it's a little bit trite, but it's certainly very valid, is that like Jeff Bezos knew he was going to build from day one. He wanted to build, the Walmart of the internet, right? Like he was going to sell friggin' everything under the sun and get it to you there really fast. He started with a bookstore, right? Like, and he didn't on day one say like, he wasn't embarrassed about it. He's like, I'm going to build the world's biggest bookstore. I'm going to be the greatest bookstore ever. Like bookstores, like it's a really, narrow, looking at where Amazon is now, like super narrow niche. But like he came out and like, he owned it. He didn't talk about, the diapers he was going to sell later. And now when he does sell diapers and ladders, no one's holding it against him, right? So like that's the other thing, is that we think that everyone's gonna like spending all this time worrying about our messaging and gonna hold consistency against us. Like no, like today you sell books, tomorrow you sell everything. That's great. Like today you sell phones for this one narrow piece of from gamers. Tomorrow you're gonna be doing something more broadly. So I think the important takeaway for entrepreneurs is to not be scared away by and realize that they actually need to have a narrow initial sort of spear that they're going to sort of I sort of imagine kill the dragon. You're gonna have to, you don't have a lot of power, you're gonna have to build a really thin long spear that you can jab into the deep into the animal, and since you're a small little startup, you have to pick a really small, sort of narrow target to go after first.
Yeah, I think kind of like periodizing your communication strategy based off of where you expect the entrepreneurial growth and the entrepreneurial journey to take you. So I think, yeah, while you're doing your revenue projections, I think that conversation should go in tandem maybe with your PR and communications. Like, okay, so if we're going to be in front of this many people at Q3, then we should we revisit our communication strategy in Q4 now that we have more positioning, more branding in the market. And so I think it's a great point to bring up. I think in terms of a lot of people, especially maybe that haven't been in marketing or anything like that, don't the press release basically is what I want to bring up. The announcement, it's relatively informal. It's very or it's very formal, but it's kind of something you put out there just to make announcements in the market. What's the life cycle of a press release? When should I publish it? What should I do with it? And should that be um, how do I nurse it? Is kind of something I would love to ask you, because sometimes press releases feel like they kind of fall into the void, like almost immediately. Like you publish it and you're like, okay, well, there goes that document, and we don't really know what happens to it after that. And so maybe you could kind of give us maybe like a bird's eye view of what should be happening to a press release, and maybe what's happening to ours.
Yep. So, okay. So first of all, let's assume that, most people that we're talking to here today in the audience, right? Small companies. So like just the fact that you exist, nobody cares. The fact that you have a new product, like nobody cares. Nobody cares that you just closed your seed round, et cetera, right? Like,
yeah.
Once you're, again, when you're Apple, when you're Google, right, and you're Toyota, right, like suddenly, you make an announcement about a new product line that has inherent interest in the marketplace because you're big, but we're not there yet. So so in that sort of falling into the void sense can make it feel like, oh, that was just a huge waste of time. But there's a couple of really, I think, important strategic values out of a press release that you can get even at the size that you're at today. The very first is actually not public at all. It's actually, and it sort of yields, sort of goes back into my sort of one of my mantras, right? That sort of communications is strategy. If you communications is not something that you add on at the end in order to put a happy little gloss on what it is that, the real work that you did. If you think of a clear communication strategy, right? If you've done that work of thinking, what are my business goals? Who do I need to reach in order to get to those business goals? What do I need to convince those people of in order to get there? And then what actions do I want to have them take? What objections might they have that I need to overcome? Once you've really thought through all those things, then you probably also have a pretty clear strategy, a business strategy. Like you can have a good business strategy without a communication strategy, but if your communication strategy really is airtight, it's pretty much definite that your strategy is, your sort of business strategy is good as well. And so the very first value of a press release is that if you write, I often encourage people to do this like way early on in a project. Like you're thinking of a new product, you're thinking of a new product line, you're thinking of where you're trying to go. It's like, write the press release first. Maybe you'll never even run it, but just the process of doing it kind of forces you to think about like, why is the outside world going to care? Like, who's going to care? Like, what's important about the fact that I'm launching this product? And that it often, and I think actually Amazon, I think does this. I think there's a couple of companies that it's sort of a requirement that sort of in step one, when someone is proposing a new line of business or another large initiative, first thing they need to do is write the press release. And it gives you a good sense of, if I were to able to achieve this, why would I, again, who would care? Why would they care? What's important about it, et cetera. So it has a sort of an important clarifying value, again, even before you get it out. So then you want to get it out and you want to sort of do it. And the press release has I think of its main benefit. There's this concept of pocket litter, right? So spies in the Cold War days, right? They'd always have like stuff in their pockets that would corroborate the story, their cover story, if they ever got arrested, right? Like, oh, you have the parking receipt, or you have the plane ticket, proves that I was just coming from Vienna. And in a way, a press release has that exact same function, especially in the early days when you're trying to convince a relatively small group of people to do things, especially in a B2B company, but even B2C companies early on. Maybe you have a small group of customers that you're trying to convince, or obviously investors, potential hires, people in the industry. First thing they're going to do is they're going to Google your name, right? If you talk to them, you call them up and you're like, hey, I'm launching this new skincare line, blah, blah, blah. Like, you should invest. First thing you're going to do is they're going to go and they're going to Google your name. And the thing is that your domain authority on your website is probably pretty crappy because you just started and you haven't done a lot with it yet. So Google doesn't really know about you yet. Whereas a lot of these press release sites, have very good domain authorities. And so by putting your release out on one of these sort of established wires, that you're sort of essentially just buying their domain authority. So now when you Google, your $3 million that you raised, if someone Googles your company name, right at the top, company X like raised $3 million. And so it's awesome corroborative evidence that people are, oh yeah, this guy's actually for real. He's not just some like, crack addict who like just, and this bender called me up and tried to like convince me of all these things. Like this guy, oh, like, look, Google says that he raised the $3 million, like must be real, right? So it has, that obviously doesn't work when you're sort of a major consumer product and sort of get to a certain stage and you're trying to just convince consumers who are less likely to sort of Google you. But again, early on, like, the people that you're trying to reach, pretty narrow. So those are the sort of two big benefits I see out of the press release. One thing is not going to happen typically is like you're going to write a press release and like send it out to a bunch of people, especially if you're small, and suddenly everyone's going to run it. You might get a couple like and by the way, not bad, like blogs or like daily news, email newsletters that are sent to certain, kind of niche audiences. They might pick it up. But TechCrunch, for example, if you just send a press release to TechCrunch, like they're pretty much never going to just write it. That's where you have to use the press release and the fact that you're announcing it as an excuse to reach out to journalists. And then you're going to have to work that directly. And I have some other thoughts. Happy to go into the outreach side and how you can go about that outreach. But
I think
beyond the press release.
Really useful is kind of like, and I love the kind of the clarification that helps out a lot, because yeah, you are using like the PR news wires of the world and kind of using because they already have a well-established brand and they kind of consume that content and redistribute it for you through those those press releases. So leveraging those kind of resources, I think, is exactly an integral. Like again, it's not just you publishing this one press release,
right?
You putting it into these established, well-defined streams that are already kind of optimized for distributing that information.
Yeah, and that's also why, like, some people ask me, like, this sort of philosophical question, like, what is a press release anyways? Like, what's the difference between me putting a blog, article on my website or me tweeting about it or whatever versus, putting out a press release? And it's a very valid, again, philosophical question. Like, the answer is there really is no difference. But the difference is that nobody's following your blog, right? And everybody's following those sites, right? So it's the exact same piece of information in this sort of digital era. There's a lot of blurring of boundaries. But the fact of the matter is that when you're out there on PR Newswire or whatever, they have a really good domain authority that just simply Google reacts to.
I think let's talk about blogs there for a second, because blogs and specifically kind of those like high frequency touch channels, like more important maybe to be in the B2C world and the B2B world, could be different based off of each startup. But in terms of there's a certain amount of work that has to go into those strategies where they're high frequency. It just means you're going to have to put more effort into your PR and communication strategy. So for those entrepreneurs like in our audience, what would you recommend you start with in terms of your PR strategy? Like, when should you scale it up, or when are you biting off too much? And you're like your communication strategy is starting to consume more of your day than actually getting work done. Because that is like, I feel like there's a lot of companies that like they would love to start a blog, or they would love to, and they have these grandiose visions of having high frequency communications, but somewhere in the middle of that, it kind of falls apart, or they just can't devote the resources to it. So how do you decide what initiatives you should engage with, and then or when to pull back?
Yeah, well, let's talk about blogs, and it's a great point, right? Everybody always starts out with the best of intentions. It's like going to the gym, right? In January, right? You get all excited about it. You're like, I'm going to go every day, and then by February, you go twice, and that's pretty much the last time you go. And the there's nothing more depressing or sort of bad signaling, right, than a blog that sort of tails off, and you look at a website, and like the last time this company put something on their company blog was 18 months ago. You're like, it's the modern equivalent of, you know, when you used to call businesses if they like didn't pick up on the, like they didn't pick up until like the 8th ring, you know, around ring 7, you're like, you know, did they go out of business?
Yeah.
And you know, blogs a little bit sort of like, you know, dead blogs are a little bit like that, and that sort of send that sort of awful signal. So and I think the reason a lot of people get started on bad blogs or blogs that they ultimately abandon is because they're sort of unclear as to why they started in the first place, right? There's a sort of feeling of that sort of really amorphous, like, we need a blog because everybody has a blog, and like we have to be out in the socials and like, you know, do all this stuff. So, you know, we have to do it. And, but there's not really a really crisp, clear reason, again, of why you're doing it or what the immediate goal is. And so that's why when life gets busy, as it always does, that at some point, you know, that just goes by the wayside. And I would say there's 2 really good reasons. Yeah, well, and then I mean, there's one good reason that, sure, like if to the degree that you can just like hire someone and that's their job and you know it's going to stay there, and you're big enough that, you know, you can just sort of, you know, just, it's just a way of looking alive. That's great. As long, so if there's an institutional reason why you think it's not going to sort of fall asleep, and you're at a certain size, like, you know, then that's great. But if you're sort of earlier and you need to be more careful about exactly how you're allocating your resources, I think there's 2 sort of really powerful reasons why you should run a blog. The first is let's start with the more narrow one. So thought leadership among sort of peer groups. So this is typically for companies that have where the really sort of thought leadership is important, right? You're not just maybe launching a new mascara and you just need a bunch of influencers, you know, touting about how great it is, but you're solving a difficult engineering problem. You're impressing the, you know, a relatively narrow set of medical researchers about this great new lab tool that you built, et cetera. There's a very strong case to be made that, you know, you want to put that those customers want to deal with people who are like, you know, thought leaders in the space, right? They have really, they're the smartest people that even if you don't want the product, you should be listening to them because boy, you know, they're doing something awesome. And so putting out sort of a relatively small number of truly sort of thoughtful articles, and this could, maybe it's once every 3 months, every 6 months. It doesn't have to be frequent, as long as over time it'll build and give you that impact. It's an opportunity to really reach a narrow set of people with sort of thoughtful content. Usually, and I started with that example because usually when people think of blogs, it's like, you know, they think, oh, like, yeah, I need like some, you know, listicles and you know, stuff to look alive. And that's generally, you know, sort of a bad or sort of an amorphous and not well thought through justification. So the very first one is that idea of really impressing a narrow set of peers as to why you're so awesome and worthy of awareness and you know, ultimately, hopefully, potentially a sale. And then the second is SEO. And a lot of people ask about, you know, oh, what is SEO, blah, blah, blah. It gets back to your earlier question about, you know, difference between marketing and communication. SEO, I would think it's more of a, honestly, it's more of a marketing undertaking. It just sort of has the guise of PR and communications, because in a way you're not paying for things except with your time and effort of writing all these articles.
Right.
But it's a very narrow, it's a very focused strategy around identifying the keywords that people are going to search when they want your product but don't know about you yet. And right, so that's the classic Google entry point. And it's a long-term powerful strategy, but emphasis on long term, because the payback is slow, it's cumulative and it builds, and then it's great. But it's you start with the keywords, and someone's going to need to pull out exactly what the keywords are. You need to find out which ones you can rank for, and then you need to write targeted content that actually appeals to those. And then your website is structured in a way that Google can search. So it's a proactive, long-term approach to going after, you know, sort of targeted keywords that you think you're going to be most effective for reaching. So it's really it's a marketing strategy really wrapped in a sort of a PR and comms look. But if you have that, then that's also something you can follow that over time, even if the numbers are small at first, right? It's something where like, okay, I put out this article and, we got, now we're on page 3 of Google, and then, you maybe put out some more and, oh, wow, we're getting, so we're starting to get, higher and higher scores. You can actually track it, which might be a better kind of reassurance to actually stick with a plan and a little long-term SEO strategy.
I think, yeah, and while you're bringing up the kind of the content stuff, there is that the channel for like content marketing is definitely a big thing, and I do besides the blog, there are a couple of different artifacts or a couple of different things that kind of exist in that world as well, like and your branding and positioning, like, but the payoff is much less significant or less like upfront. So, for instance, I'm thinking of a white paper, right? So what is your intention behind publishing a white paper? Besides, like, thought leadership is important, but a white paper it's research, it's work, it takes time, a lot of energy. So what are you hoping to gain out of something that robust? And has the payoff in your experience, like seeing some artifacts like this or others, has that paid off in the end? Has it really generated the kind of the branding or positioning that these entities want?
Yeah, I mean, white paper it's a bit of a flexible term, honestly. I mean, the idea is always that it is, as you put it, it's it's well researched. It's scientific on some level, right? A lot of footnotes and research went into it. The fact of the matter is, what most people sell as like the white paper on something is really just sort of marketing and in another in a lab coat maybe. And it's but it has some very important, no matter what it is, like it has some really important sort of uses. And again, first of all, let's clarify that I think generally speaking, right, it's like a B2B type product, right? Like, white papers for consumer products, like this new drink, here's the white paper. But it has that aura of the sort of scientificness. I write them fairly regular for companies, for example, that are going to try to convince the CTO of something, right? Like a relatively high person that wants to be, whose left brain wants to be addressed. They want to understand more. They want to go deeper. And so, I'll send you the white paper. It carries with it sort of almost a sort of reassuring scientific justification. It feels like, oh, here, I'm going to get past the marketing and going to get to the real thing. So it has an important sort of, just by its mere sort of cloak, it sort of comes dressed as something that maybe cuts past a lot of the otherwise filters that they might have in place for getting rid of marketing and fluff talk. The other thing a white paper can be good for, and as are then sort of ebooks and a whole other sort of the whole genre of like larger in-depth PDFs, is it's an opportunity to collect people's email address. It's an opportunity to sort of continue the conversation. If like the funnel isn't, awareness, purchase, if there's like a bunch of steps between awareness and purchase, like, it can be an important one to get you down that funnel. Maybe, again, collect the email address or join the webinar, or it's an important tool that, a little lure that can help pull people down that list as they get to where you want them to go.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, it can really contribute to the helping people along that funnel. It doesn't have to be the first touch point that somebody interacts with your product, but it can be the thing that continues that conversation down the road if they find it's something that they can circle back to if they want to look back at that information, if it is relevant to their brand. Otto, I definitely monopolized a lot of your time with my own personal questions today. That being said, I feel like we covered a lot of things that are
it's great
for our audience. This is going to be published on the Passport platform, so this will be and we'll be distributing the recording to pretty much the entire Passport audience. So I just want to thank you for your time and your effort. For those of you on Passport, Otto is one of 175 other mentors that we have. Expert in the field, truly a master of your craft. Thank you for answering all of my questions today. We're looking forward to kind of facilitating a couple of more of these down the road. We're definitely going to be grabbing some more people in here and maybe leveraging the Slack channel a bit more. But just want to thank you for your time and energy today in this kind of AMA.
This is awesome. Listen, I really appreciate it. Super smart questions. Thank you for all of you who are listening and are going to watch again this on the replay. Super pleasure to be involved with One Valley. It's a great organization, and I'm delighted to be part of it.
For the rest of our audience here, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and kind of end the stream now. Expect this recording to be on the internet in roughly a week. So we'll make an announcement email that we'll send out to all of our Passport community. And would love for you to come circle back or get in touch with Otto. Would love for our community to engage with him and utilize him as a resource. He very much is one for our community. Otto, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Fabulous. Thanks to all of you. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.